Hello, my name is Emily Chadwick, and my capstone project is on natural disasters, analyzing worldwide risk perception and experience. I chose this topic because I've lived in Nashville for the past 15 years, and during that time, we've had a serious flood, as depicted in these photos on this title page, 2 tornadoes, a derecho, severe heat and cold events, and a lot more. I've become a lot more concerned about disasters in the past few years because of what I've seen here, and wanted to know if other people around the world felt the same way. And as a social worker, I'm also interested in people's feelings of mental health and anxiety. So for this project, I worked with 2 different data sets. The first one was the Lloyd's Register Foundation World Risk Poll. This is a survey that's done every 2 years in collaboration with Gallup to learn more about people's feelings of risk from a lot of different things. I used data from their 2021 survey, in which they talked to about 126,000 people in 121 countries. You can see all the countries that were represented in the survey here on the map in pink. It's a pretty good representation across the world, except if you're looking at Africa, you'll notice that there's a lot of countries missing. So that's something to keep in mind as we go through the analysis. They tried to get a representative sample of people from each country. Most countries had 1,000 participants, but some larger countries like China, India, and Russia had larger numbers to reflect their large populations. The second data source I worked with was EM-DAT, the International Disaster Database. They catalog disasters occurring between 1900 and the present day, and they're constantly updating as new disasters occur. The criteria for being included in the database are listed here. A disaster has to have at least 10 fatalities, 100 people affected, a declaration of a state of emergency, or a call for international assistance. And in this chart below, you can see the different types of disasters they catalog. I included in my project just disasters that they classify as natural disasters. They also track technological disasters, which include things like man-made events, like explosions, train derailments, things like that. But for natural disasters, there's about 15,000 listed in the database, and wanted to go through the different types they include. The largest number of disasters occur in this hydrological category, which is different types of floods and water-related events. The next one is meteorological, which includes storms and extreme temperatures. This also encompasses things like tornadoes, blizzards, etc. Geophysical disasters include things like earthquakes and volcanoes. Climatological includes different types of droughts and forest fires. There's finally the last category is extraterrestrial. Unfortunately, this is not aliens. This includes meteor collisions with the Earth. And there's actually only one included in the database. This occurred, you can see in this video here. Give it a second to load. This happened in Russia in 2013 when a huge meteor entered the Earth's atmosphere and actually exploded, and they created a shock wave that exploded windows out of buildings across 6 different cities and sent 1,500 people to the hospital with injuries from broken glass. So moving on to the analysis, my analysis started with this question. Does having personal experience of a natural disaster impact your perception of risk? So first, let's define terms. For risk perception, I looked at a couple different questions on the survey. The first one was, what do you consider the greatest source of risk to safety in your daily life? And people were able to choose from these different categories. So I've highlighted here in pink the answers related to natural disasters. So about 2,700 people total said that climate change or severe weather was their greatest source of risk to their safety. And then down here, about 700 people said that non-weather related disasters were the greatest source of risk. This also included things like tornadoes and earthquakes. I'm sorry, tornadoes and tsunamis. So the next question was, how worried are you about experiencing serious harm from severe weather? And a pretty large group of people said yes, they're very worried. About 43,000 people said they're very worried about serious harm from severe weather. So next, looking at personal experience, there were a few questions on the survey that related to this as well. So people were asked, have you ever experienced a disaster arising from a natural hazard in the last 5 years? About 25% of people said yes. If they said yes, they were asked what type of natural hazard was it. The largest group of people by far said it was a flood, which, as you'll remember, matches up with the disaster database, where the largest category of disasters is floods. They were also asked, have you or someone you know had serious harm from severe weather in the last 2 years? And about 10% of people said that yes, they have personally experienced serious harm. So going further into the analysis, we can see using these slicers over here on the right that for people who've had disaster experience, that this category moves up in the rankings, as well as this one. And then the group of people who were very worried, that percentage increases for people who've experienced disasters. Then if we add in people who've experienced harm from disasters in the last 2 years, you can see this category go even further up the rankings, and the percentage of people who are very worried increases. So it seems like there is a correlation between having experience and having a high perception of risk. My next question was, how do different demographic factors impact perception of risk? So looking again at these people who said they were very worried, I wanted to know what factors influence that the most. So from this key influencers chart, you can see that the biggest factor in that was income. So for people who said they're finding it very difficult to live on their present income, as you can click here on the slicer and see, that percentage of people who are very worried increases dramatically, which makes sense. If people are already living on the edge financially, a disaster is going to be a huge fear for them, as it's going to make things even worse. Some other important demographic factors related to people's feelings of risk are having 5 or more children, living in a rural area, and women. So you can play around with these different slicers down here and see how these different factors impact people's feelings of being very worried. My next question was, is there a relationship between perception of risk and country level experience? So I looked at the people who said they were very worried about disasters and found the top 10 countries that were represented. The largest number of respondents were from India. And as you can see from the map below, a lot of countries in Africa were represented in this group, as well as in Southeast Asia. Then comparing that to the disaster database and finding the countries that have had the most disasters in the 5 years prior to the study, we see that the US and China are number 1 and 2, and 3, 4, and 5 are Indonesia, India, and the Philippines, which also match up with this very worried group. So you do see that overlap, especially in these countries here in Southeast Asia. And then finally, I wondered if risk perception was correlated with disaster severity. So there's a number of different factors in the disaster database that can show how severe a disaster was. One of these is how many times that the country appealed for international aid after a disaster. Was a state of emergency declared? And you can see here the countries who have declared a state of emergency the most number of times. The US is leading with 35 declarations. Once again, I'm looking at the 5 years right before the survey happened. So there were about 1,600 disasters during that time. And you can see for all countries included, there were about 457 million people affected by disasters and about $1 billion in damage. I also looked at the total number of people injured and killed by disasters. Now you'll see here on the chart a big spike in 2018. And that's actually represented. If you look here at the map, you'll see that the size of these bubbles indicates how many people were injured. So Japan and Indonesia had pretty large circles for a lot of people injured. This was because in 2018 was that very large tsunami in Indonesia. And Japan also in 2018 had several large disasters as well. So that's the cause of that spike that year. And if you want to look further at country level data, you can select countries here and see the impacts. So yeah, if you go down to Indonesia, for example, you can see that large spike in the number of people injured that year. So going further into the analysis about disaster severity, I rated countries based on the number of people affected by disasters, the total damage amount, and the number of deaths, and found that the biggest danger zones were China, India, and the United States, because they were represented as one of the top 10 countries for all three of these categories. And then Bangladesh was represented in two of these categories, so they could be considered to be in a risk zone for disaster severity. Then looking once again at this very worried group, the top 10 countries that were represented, you could say comparing these charts to the countries in the very worried group, you could say that India and the Philippines are worried for good reason because they do have severe disasters, as you can see in the chart. You might say that the US is blissfully unaware. However, that's kind of a misnomer. The US is probably, although we do have a lot of severe disasters here, it's more likely that other demographic factors, such as our higher average income, make us not as worried as other countries in the developing world who don't have as much of a financial safety net as we do here in the United States. I also wanted to highlight China. They show up as having very severe disasters throughout this data set, but we actually don't know how they feel about those disasters. We don't know their feelings of risk because that question about risk perception was not asked in China due to the political situation there. It could be that people expressing feelings of risk may be seen as not having faith in their government. So it was decided to not even ask that survey question in China. So we don't know how people in China feel about disasters. So in conclusion, we can see clearly that people are very worried about natural disasters. This is especially true for people who've experienced them before, vulnerable groups such as people who are low income, families with children who live in rural areas, and then especially people in Southeast Asia where disasters are frequent and severe. So what can we do? We obviously can't stop disasters from happening. And unfortunately, with climate change, they're just going to continue to increase and get worse. But what we can do is focus on preparation. I wanted to highlight one last question on the survey. They asked people if they felt like they and their families were well prepared for disasters. For people who said, no, my family and I are not well prepared, they were actually more likely to be in this very worried group. And for people who said that they are well prepared, they're slightly more likely to be in this not worried group. I also wanted to highlight a study that was done in 2020 in Haiti, in an area that is especially prone to earthquakes and floods. Researchers did a study on combining mental health awareness and disaster preparedness. They did a 3-day intervention with a group of about 480 people. And through combining information about mental health and how to prepare for disasters, the results showed that people felt more prepared, had reduced feelings of anxiety, depression, and PTSD, and increased feelings of peer support. So my recommendation overall is that something like this study, this research be done in areas like Southeast Asia where people feel especially vulnerable, so that we can help them be more prepared and have better mental health outcomes as well. Thank you so much.